firstly, is it important our leaders are steeped in history? And I appreciate there are ways in which this can go wrong. I know Hitler and Mussolini were famous for knowing their history, and they weren't exactly good, but we also had Churchill. I'm obviously going to bring him up as a Brit, but that famous speech of his, which popularized in the darkest hour, he starts exhorting the British people that what we're seeking to defend is something that makes us unique. We're, a Christian civilization, and if we are able to stand up to the Nazi threat, then we might be able to embolden our European neighbours to do the same. So there's examples of which history is important to be able to rally a people and give them a sense of common purpose. Do you have a view of why you think knowing our history is important, and do we need historical leaders?
I mean, you could add to Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, Putin is probably the biggest fan of, and it's been a lot. Apparently, there's been a lot of lockdown reading about Catherine the Great conquering Ukraine. So, I mean, I agree with Dominic Sandbrook on this in some sense. And a lot of history is probably quite bad for a society, because historical memory kind of sort of bring old wounds back and kind of trigger more conflict. And in some senses, it's almost better than that we forget about history a little bit. I mean, of modern leaders, it's hard to look at them and not be quite negative in comparison with someone like Churchill, who had this kind of sense of Britain's long history and its destiny. I wonder though if history has become it's kind of two things, because on one level, kind of historical ignorance is quite widespread, and on another, it's kind of on the sort of subculture has never been more popular. I mean, rest history is a kind of good example of that. But there's also, on documentaries and books, there's this sort of avid interest in history. I suppose what is missing is a shared narrative, which I guess hasn't been around commonly for a good 60 or 70 years. Certainly wasn't when I was at school, which is, the kind of history of the country as taught through its sort of royal family. It's kind of common. Funny thing is when, people on Twitter or sort of like, whatever, so talk about, this is not history you're taught at school, and they always have this kind of idea that all your history teachers when we were growing up were all sort of these kind of right-wing fanatics who had pictures of the British Empire on the wall, and I just think, right, how old are you? You're like 110 years old for that. I was just anyone my age or even older. It just hasn't been the story, and that, I suppose, that sense of Britain, or I suppose you could say England, kind of the two are sort of mixed up. It was very much tied to that kind of post-Tudor Protestant and imperial sense of self, which is not just unfashionable, but it would be basically impossible to sort of rehash that. But I do wonder. I mean, I think these things are confined. I mean, I imagine there is probably a big gap in knowledge between people, for example, who went to like old public schools and went to state schools. So unless they've changed a lot. But I remember meeting someone maybe early 20s who had gone to a public school, and he kind of casually mentioned Piers Gaveston in a conversation. I didn't know him that well, and I just thought, like, literally no one who went to my school would know who that is. It would be such an obscure reference to the average person. But maybe there was a time when someone like that, or like Warwick Kingmaker, gets mentioned in a Peep Show by Mark, who's like obviously a dweeb, would be part of that kind of common cultural knowledge. But I just don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, one thing is that history is kind of is sort of seen as a morality tale now, which I think is a really bad thing. Which is why the particular focus on, like the story of the rise of Nazis. We all did that at school, and I mean, I think everyone still does it at school. Which is like history should be taught as like, oh, we should learn from history, and it's like, as a kind of never again thing. But I think we should just, the point of history is, firstly, it should just be interesting and fun. But secondly, as a kind of national narrative, I think it's quite important to understand, where things come from and why, our country kind of does matter and why our country is like as it is. So, the kind of thing I'm interested in is particularly that weaving a narrative from Alfred the Great, and then through things like Magna Carta, and then the kind of political conflicts of the 17th century, which explain so much of why we are. And I think that's kind of lacking. I think particularly I see that when I'm sort of debating people about multiculturalism is another example, that there is a complete absence of thinking about the historical examples of this, and the link between multiculturalism and an empire, and the difficulties it's always had with sort of liberal norms. I just think people are completely unaware of this and kind of willingly unaware of this, which I just find baffling. It's like, surely, you should, if you have a policy direction, you should surely study where it's happened before, so you can have some sort of idea of what you're expecting. But I don't know. I guess that just doesn't exist as a mindset.